just finished a book this week. First off, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I just finished a book this week called Leaving Eastern Parkway. I don't know if anybody's read it. It was recommended to me by Margot Marin, and she loved it, she said, so I, of course, had to read it. And since it's been a little quiet at the shul the last couple of weeks, I've had an opportunity to read a couple books, and this was one of them. And it's a great, great story. It's a lovely story. It's a beautiful story. It's a problematic story. It's about a young little Hasidic boy who eventually finds his way to leaving Eastern Parkway. He's a little Hasidic Lubavitcher boy in that very, very tight-knit community, and his sister leaves before him, and ultimately his parents pass away, and he ends up leaving Eastern Parkway. I don't want to tell you much more of this story, except that throughout his entire transformation within this book, he never stops wearing a kippah. It's a strange little detail that throughout the book bothered me. But it was an interesting and important detail because the book, I believe, is ultimately about identity and maintaining your identity and who are you really. And is there a way to express who you are really deep down outwardly? It's a beautiful, beautiful book, and my hope is that eventually it'll make it to our book club list. I would remind you that we do have a book club coming up soon, and the book that we're reading is a book called Waking Lions. Waking Lions is a translated book from Hebrew, and it is an incredible, incredible challenge to those of us who are living post-October 7th, even though it happened, the book was written before October 7th, and Joseph, you should tell your dad that it was he who recommended the book. It's an incredibly powerful book. Dr. Andy Goldstein recommended that book to me years ago already at this point. In any case, this little boy makes it out of Eastern Parkway but maintains some pintele yid, some little spark of what it means to be the Jew that was deep inside him by wearing his kippah. What's really, really interesting is in next week's Parsha, we're going to see an incredible moment in which Joseph is reunited with Jacob, this time, though, on Jacob's deathbed, and he brings his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And in that moment, we recognize the power of what it means to keep that spark of Yiddishkeit alive in your life. Because Joseph, who had all the trappings of the highest office in the land, names his children Ephraim and Manasseh, seemingly Jewish names, right? And that's how we got to that as an introduction for our blessing of our children, certainly for boys. You know that when we bless our children, when we bless our girls, we say, Yisimech Elohim Kisara Rivka Rachel v'Leah. May God bless you like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. But when we bless our boys, what we say is, Yisimcha Elohim ke-Ephraim v'Manasseh, that may you be like Ephraim and Manasseh. And the rabbis tell us that that's the introduction to the blessing that we give our children, at least our boys, is because even in the throes of Egypt, even occupying the most assimilated office you could possibly occupy, they maintained their sense of being Jewish. And so that becomes the blessing for all of our children, that even though they enjoy all the trappings of being a great American and all the great luxury of what it means to live in the classes that we live in, that they should maintain their sense of Yiddishkeit, their sense of Judaism. All that is to say that there is an outside person and there's an inside person. And I don't mean people who like video games as opposed to sports, or kids who like to read as opposed to play outside. I mean, there is an inner self and there is an outer self. And sometimes that inner self cries out to be outside. Sometimes there are things that happen within us that we have pent up for so long that they explode out into the outside world. Sometimes that happens in an extremely creative moment, and sometimes it happens in an extraordinarily destructive moment. right now taking a course online to reduce my car insurance. It's a 6-hour course. What? Yeah, it's a defensive driving course.
Offensive or defensive?
Defensive. I'm 7 into these 8 sessions, which means I'm basically done with it. And today I say it wasn't worth the 10% or whatever I'm going to get off. In any case, it talks about people who experience road rage and the techniques that you can employ so that you don't break out into road rage. And it asks you, not as part of any quiz, which they do have there in order for you to pass it, just to take a moment and reflect. And it asks you, have you ever felt X, Y, or Z? Now, I clicked no, even though the answer was yes. Because I'm not prepared to admit to some of the feelings I've had while driving on the road. But it offers us opportunities to not literally, but figuratively take our foot off the gas pedal when we feel the rage beginning to explode. And what we have in this morning's Parsha is that moment of where the internal becomes external. The moment in which everything bubbles up to the surface and Joseph can't hold it back anymore. So let's read this first pasuk, or this only pasuk we're going to look at, because really what I want to look at today is the Ramban at the bottom of the page. Okay? So, somebody want to read either the Hebrew or the English, preferably the English, since we all know English better than we know Hebrew. Right at the very top of the page. Robin, you read every week. You can't read every week.
I'll do it.
Okay.
All right.
Joseph,
I still get to make announcements? Okay, sorry.
Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone withdraw from me." So there was no one else about when Joseph made himself known to his brothers.
Okay? So I'm going to read the Hebrew because you can see I have highlighted one word. Is it highlighted on yours? Oh, it's not. Sorry, I made myself a color-coded copy. I printed one copy in color. Don't worry, Debbie. I think we can afford one color copy. Debbie is now giving me permission to copy them all in color. So here's the one word. V'lo yachol Yosef lehitapek. And according to the English, it says, and Joseph could no longer control himself. That word lehitapek is so full. It is the moment before he explodes. Lo yachol od Yosef lehitapek, or lo yachol Yosef lehitapek. He wasn't able to control himself. And then it says, l'chol hanitzavim alayv, in front of all the people who were in front of him, right? Vayikra hotzia kol ish me'alai, get rid of everybody, get out, everybody get out, I can't take it anymore. You can see, this is an extraordinarily powerful moment. One of the most, I think, emotional moments in the Torah. You can see the pent-up anger, the pent-up sadness, the pent-up loneliness of Joseph in this moment. And he says, everybody get out. Everybody. I want to be by myself, or at least I just want to be alone with my brothers. Right? V'lo amad ish ito b'hitvada Yosef el achav, and no one remained except Joseph's brothers. Right? And then it comes out. This is what we're seeing here is the second before the explosion. The quiet before the storm. It's a very, very powerful moment with so much built-up emotion. I ask you now to think to yourself for a moment, what must have been going on in that moment for Joseph, and what has gone on in your life in those moments before you explode. Of course, I would remind you that often what you tend to explode about has nothing to do with what has been building to that moment. 90% of the time, I have no idea what the statistic is, I just made it up. Most of the time in our lives when we explode, it has nothing to do with what the explosion seems to be about. And so I asked that same question of Joseph, but I ask it of you. In the moments where you have exploded, where you've broken down, maybe just started crying, maybe moments in which you just started screaming. You know, there's something called scream therapy. Did you ever hear of it? I think it works, actually. Right? Just make sure you're not screaming at somebody. Right? The damage that we do in those moments of explosion are extraordinary. And sometimes it takes that explosion to figure out what's really going on in the first place. So I can't really guess what's going on in Joseph's mind at this moment. I can imagine that years of loneliness have built to this moment. I can imagine the variety of traumas that Joseph experienced in his life from the very youngest days till the time he got thrown into the ditch, from the time he got sold into slavery and then resold again into slavery, from the time he was thrown in the dungeon to the time that he ascends from it. You can imagine the variety of traumas he must have felt. All the people that Joseph must have felt betrayed by, not the least of which was his own father, which I only imagine because Joseph's father wasn't the first person Joseph let know he was alive. Can you imagine that? Joseph rises to great power in Egypt. He could do anything, could go anywhere. He doesn't tell his father he's alive. Imagine how angry he must have been, how betrayed he must have felt. And it goes on and on and on. It makes a lot of sense to me that at some point Joseph is going to explode. Imagine for yourselves all of the traumas you have experienced, that you have pushed down deeper and deeper with only ambition to drive you and motivate you. And eventually it'll come out. It says this pasuk that Joseph was unable to control himself. That's the word that is used there, lehit apek, unable to control himself. So now, turn the page over. Let's look at Ramban. Now I gave you the Hebrew. We're not going to do anything with the Hebrew, but we're going to look at basically 3 or 4 sections of this Ramban, of this Nachmanides. You didn't get one, Michael?
No, it's okay.
Just share. Yeah.
It's okay.
Okay. All right. Then Joseph could not lihit apek, refrain himself, keep himself back, control himself before all of them that stood before him. Here's the first thing that Ramban says. He could not bear that the Egyptians should stand by witnessing how his brothers had put him to shame. His brothers would be put to shame, sorry. Right? What's the first thing? What's the reason why Joseph says everybody get out?
He's going to scratch your car. Save his brothers.
Right. What does Ramban's first comment say? Has nothing to do with Joseph. What's he say? The first thing that he says is, I don't want to embarrass my brothers in front of these Egyptians. They're going to hear the story about how they treated me, and they're going to be embarrassed. So let me ask you something. When you finally explode, and I'm making that a given, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be, but when you finally explode, why does it usually happen according to you? Someone else. They did it. Right? Had nothing to do with me or my sense of insecurity. Right? It's them. I'm protecting them. I explode not for myself, but because of them. To protect them, not to protect myself. You know that when you explode, it's out of a sense of anger. And anger, as I've often said to you, I believe, is the other side of the coin of fear. We get angry when we're really afraid. Imagine to yourself every time you've gotten angry, and then ask yourself, what am I afraid of? Anger is a protection against somebody doing harm to you. I'll get them first. Many people say, I'll break up with them before they can break up with me. All right? So he says he's going to protect the brothers when he makes himself known to them. All right, now skip down. Unkelus. You see where it says in the middle of the paragraph, it says Unkelus, just 3 lines down or 4 lines below that. Does everybody see it says Unkelus? Unkelus was an Aramaic translation of the Torah. So what Unkelus does is, for people who don't read Hebrew, don't understand Hebrew, Unkelus said, for those of you in the Aramaic world who don't really understand Hebrew, I'm just going to translate it. And so Ramban uses, and of course, Ramban understands every translation as a commentary in its first stage. Right? So Unkelus, however, translated Lahitapek as meaning to strengthen himself. According to Unkelus, by Ramban's reading, what happens to Joseph is he explodes because he can't strengthen himself. He can't steel himself. He explodes not as an act of aggression, but because of a lack of capacity to hold himself back. I don't know, did you ever hear the phrase, it just broke me? Right? I wasn't able to hold myself back. I just broke. I snapped, I think is the words that we use most often. I snapped because I wasn't able to control myself. Right? And then it goes on. Skip 2 more lines. The correct interpretation, in my opinion, now, Ramban's going to say, I'll explain really what was going on in that moment. The correct interpretation, in my opinion, is that there were present many people of Pharaoh's house and other Egyptians, pleading with Joseph to pardon Benjamin for their compassions, were deeply stirred by Judah's pleas, and Joseph could not overcome them all. What's going on, says Ramban right now? Why did Joseph say, get out? Everybody get out? Why? According to Ramban, what's the real reason why Joseph couldn't control himself anymore and ordered everybody to leave? Peer pressure. He couldn't take it anymore. Everybody was jumping all over him. Let him know. Let him go. Let him know. Let him go. That is, let him know who you are. Let him go. That is Benjamin. Everybody was ganging up on him. And eventually he couldn't take it anymore and he cracked. He says to everybody, get out. I can't listen to it anymore. It's too much pressure on me. Did you ever hear the phrase, I can't take it anymore? That's what Joseph is saying, according to Ramban. I can't take it anymore. It's too much pressure. I gotta be me. Leave me alone. Stop telling me what to do all the time. I don't know if you've ever heard those phrases when you're having an argument. Right? Ramban says something really beautiful here. And that is, sometimes we feel ganged up on. We feel like the world is against us. We feel like everybody is against me. And Ramban says there's something really powerful here. And that is, oftentimes in our life when we feel ganged up upon, it's not because of what other people are telling us. It's because of an internal voice that's being affirmed by other people. It's really powerful. Let's read one more piece. Go down 3/4 of the page, about 8 lines from the bottom of the page. It says, and the reason for the removal is, do you everybody see where I am? Towards the bottom. And the reason for the removal is that he expelled them from there so they should not hear when he mentions the matter of the sale of his brothers, because it would be a source of distress to them and also to himself. Finally, Ramban says, you got to put yourself back in the story. Finally, Ramban Nachmanides tells us something really powerful. If you're ever going to really understand why you exploded, you have to put yourself back in the story. You have to understand the role that you play in your life, that you're not just the object of what everybody else is doing. It's not that life happened to you, but that you participated in it as well. Ramban offers us these really powerful readings to what was going on internally in Joseph's life. What's most powerful to me is that he offers a variety of different explanations, which to me means he doesn't really know. Anytime you have an abundance of theories about anything, it means you really don't know. That's usually what happens. The explosion for Joseph and for us, if it happens in our lives, is an opportunity for exploration. Explosion is an opportunity for exploration, to understand what's going on within us. Each and every one of us has a moment in our life in which we will feel as though we have been pushed beyond our limit, and that will crack, will snap, will break. That's an opportunity for exploration. Joseph tells us we can only handle so much in our lives. Right? You've heard the phrase, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I don't think I believe that. But what I do believe is moments of explosion offer us opportunities for breakthroughs. It's not that we've been broken, but that we have an opportunity to see more clearly something we haven't seen before about ourselves. This moment for Joseph is a moment that is an epiphany of self. It's a moment of enlightenment in which he sees himself differently than he saw himself before. I won't really want to call it a breakdown. I'd rather call it a breakthrough. Shabbat shalom. We continue with